Judith is a very active member of the local community. She's here in her capacity as chair of the Friends of the Lake District, and we're going to hear her views on how Ullswater has benefited from the work of the Friends of the Lake District. She's had a long involvement in the work of the National Park as a representative of the National Parks, and as a trustee also of the Wordsworth Trust in Grasmere. She has been a trustee of Friends of the Ullswater Way, but because of conflicts of interest, she resigned when she was appointed the chair of the Friends of the Lake District. We're looking forward very much to hearing her talk today. Welcome, Judith, and over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you for that. Good research. I'm going to put the mic on, sorry. So I think that will remain clearer, if I'm right. Is that clearer on Zoom as well? Fine, okay. So thank you, and thanks Tim, Gordon and Friends of the Ullswater Way for this kind invitation to talk about the area I live in. I think everybody in the hall should be able to hear fine. I'm sorry if this is a bit echoey. Anybody on Zoom who can't, Gordon, we think we're okay. Good. I'm going to make it clear just from the beginning that I've consulted quite a range of sources for this, partly because there are a lot of people who know a great deal more about Friends of the Lake District than I do, and many of them have been enormous help. Thank them very much. Some of them sitting in the room, including my husband. Others are things like the Berry and Beard book on conservation in the lakes, and a previous colleague, Jeremy and Anne Robinson, and obviously several of the team at Friends of the Lakes who've been incredibly helpful. Just before I get going, so that we're completely clear, this is about Ullswater, and this is a picture of the map of Ullswater. I'm sure lots of people already know this very well, but I'm not going to really stray far beyond that. I hope that's pretty clear. One of the largest lakes, visited by about 500,000 people, even in a quiet year, home to Greenside Mines, Helvellyn, Wainwright's second favourite mountain, Place Fell, and obviously significant attractions like the steamers, Bridge biscuits, Wordsworth daffodils, and a whole number of other things. If there are any members listening to this talk, thank you for your support for the Friends of the Lake District. Everyone else, thank you for coming, and all feedback welcome, including your welcome to join the Friends. And there are leaflets available on the Friends of the Lake District website, and there are some in the hall. I hope that is helpful. It's not supposed to be a sales pitch from now on. I'm going to talk about what is the Friends of the Lake District, what does the Friends do, and what does the Friends do now and has done around the Ullswater area. I think it's really important to have the broader context, if that's okay with everybody. The Friends of the Lake District is an independent charity. It's a membership organisation and dedicated to protecting and enhancing Cumbria's landscapes. Now, protecting doesn't just mean saying don't do things. It does mean looking after. Enhancing can be a whole range of things, some of which are contentious, like some tree planting schemes. It's absolutely part of the Friends' belief that the Lake District has some of the most spectacular and precious landscapes in England. And the charity works for that landscape for the benefit of local communities, visitors, wildlife and habitats. And that's really important as part of the context of the work I'm going to outline. The Friends was established in 1934, before any national parks, and that's quite an important part of the history of the Friends. It grew primarily from concern that we had about roads and development and too many visitors in the 1930s, which gives you, probably if you still live here, quite a picture of how some things move on. They don't necessarily change in some ways. The main work of the Friends is landscape and the impact on the landscape. And the work includes and has included campaigning, events, and many special projects. Quite a lot of work now involves work with the other national park societies, and there are national park societies in the whole of England, in Wales, in Scotland coming, and possibly in Northern Ireland eventually. Arguably, the work has kept on through both good and bad times. There have been lots of difficult challenges as well as successes. That's because some of the topics picked up and what people are worried about are very contentious, and defence or protection or conservation always has several sides to it. And I think it's quite important for a charity that's been concerned with the landscape to remember all those different views. Now, Friends of the Lake District is still working to protect the landscape, but that hasn't really changed hugely since 1934. It's working with partners, so that's local people, national organisations, as I mentioned, landowners, businesses, and there are some large businesses in the Ullswater area who are extremely supportive, communities, that means people who live around Ullswater, in the Lake District and in Cumbria. The members, of the 6,000 plus members, about half are in Cumbria, and just under a half in the Lake District National Park, and a whole range of supporters. The work done is from specific to the general, so that is picking up planning applications, reading them, sending in comments, concerns, but it's also thinking about much more generally, what do huge projects like the World Heritage Status Project mean for the National Park and indeed for the rest of Cumbria. The Friends also owns land and properties, and it arranges events, and I'll come on to some of these. Work parties, litter picks, very exciting, very relevant, talks, training, a whole lot of things that other organisations do also work on, and there's lots of collaboration on some of these. I'm just going to check the timing. The noise is all right, isn't it?
We're just checking because people are saying there's a bit of echo.
There is an echo. Do you all hear an echo?
Can you manage that mic to it?
Yes, is that better?
It would be better because the people on Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be better.
I think I could do the hall. It's the Zoom.
The Zoom's fine.
Is Zoom better like that?
Yes, that's what they're saying.
You've changed your advice.
That's what we're being told.
Fine. Okay. Does that sound better?
I can't tell.
Yes.
Yes, Gordon. Yeah, no, looking at Gordon. So I'm going to talk about why the landscape matters. And this is one of my favourite pictures of the landscape round here, which is the pink sheep that appear on the Hartsop Fells in late spring. This is a 2021 picture, but the World Heritage statement about the Lake District says that the Lake District has an association of artistic work, a work of outstanding national, universal, stop waving at me, I know I'm shouting, outstanding universal significance. I think the pink sheep of Hartsop are part of that. Some of the landscapes, and this is just a quick reminder of what we're really trying to consider. This is winter, this is round Ullswater, these are all, guess where? Wordsworth daffodils, most of you will know of them. Summer, this is not an advertisement for the steamers, but it is part of the summer landscape in a very big way, as is the sailing boat, which you might not be so clear. And here's autumn, near Falling Rocks, near Ullswater. These are all part of what the landscape round here is celebrated for and needs some thought about. I'm now going to talk, the main topic is what do the communities, what does the Friends do in this area? So it works with the communities, come on to some examples of that. It's important to realise that in some of these things, the Friends is not the driver of the work. It may be the supporter, it may be helping, it may be in partnership. There's a whole range of different activities. That also applies to the campaigns. And possibly the most significant, relevant, recent campaign has been the discussion about whether there should have been a zip wire in Glenridding. That was a really important thing, really led, in fact, in that case, by the local community, not so much by the organisations. There are events, and I'll come on to some of those. And there's a key issue about raising the profile of some key threats to the landscape around here, as well as some significant planning challenges. the participant or leading is really a varied part of what the Friends does, and it has specific staff. One of the greater examples of the work that happened with the communities was in around 2015 to 2017, when, as part of the work on World Heritage, the Friends and other people in this area worked on the Valley Plan. That brought together a huge range of interests across the area. It was a pilot project, which was part of the concept that led to part of the World Heritage bid for the Lake District. Wordsworth described the Lake District as having 13 valleys. This valley was chosen as the one where a pilot plan would be put together. And the Friends of the Lake District officer, who's now the Dark Skies officer, Jack Ellaby, led the work, chairing a very, very wide range of residents, businesses, rangers, and there were discussions for about 6 months about priorities and the next steps. This delivered a whole range of significant things, some of which aren't associated with the Valley Plan any longer, one of which was the Ullswater Valley, which has really changed a number of tourist and residential perspectives in the area. Bits of the land, I mean, you will all, I'm sure many of you will know this, bits of footpath were joined up, funds were found, and in the end, Friends of the Ullswater Way was also formed. There was also significant change as part of that Valley Plan to press for local housing, and some of those projects are slowly moving forward. One of the things that the pilot work didn't expect, I think, this is my memory, is that there would be a real feeling from a number of communities that not enough importance was being given to environmental considerations, like the quality of the water in the lake, and particular concerns about some biodiversity issues, which 7 or 8 years ago were really starting to become a much more significant part of lots of people's thinking. And there was work that was pushed forward on that, some of which has been overtaken by other projects in later time. Inevitably, it ran out of money, but here's a picture of what the Valley Plan tried to pull together. And it was an extraordinarily innovative piece of work. About 120 plus people across the area came to different meetings, and there were major organizations, all of them represented. And it was just a very unusual and different thing, which was tried in different ways in some of the other valleys, most notably in Borrowdale, but it was a different kind of structure. This was probably the largest of what was tried. And certainly that was a project that the Friends of the Lake District led on in a way that probably pulled it together very successfully. Well, fairly, sorry, I've gone too quickly. The other thing the Friends has done around here is work with a lot of the communities. There are things called Fell Care Days, and the most recent one was actually in Ullswater this year, but of course they stopped for 2 years during the pandemic. And it organises what's called the Great Cumbria Litter Pick. I actually feel a bit nervous about saying that about the litter pick, because the organiser of the local WI litter picks is sitting in this audience. However, the Great Cumbria Litter Pick is slightly different. It uses some canoes, it uses a different range of skills. So with apologies to Patterdale and Glenridding WI, I'll keep going. But one of the examples of the Friends of the Litter Pick, after, some of you will recognise, this is a slide about Storm Desmond, which was devastating, particularly around Ullswater in a whole range of ways. I'm sure lots of people remember them. But one of the things the Friends did after that was organise what was called a Fell Care Day. About 70 different people came. There were path restorations, there were a whole range of things. And just to show this is true, this is not a picture of somebody running away from under Horseman Bridge. It's actually a picture of the Chief Executive of Friends of the Lake District digging with Rob Shepherd, who's the chair of the Parish Council, who's the orange hat behind. And there was a lot of work to clear some of the very, very badly blocked areas of some of the watercourses, which was part of that day. And that's what local community linked projects that the Friends manages to organise, not everywhere and not all the time, but it's an important part of the work. And most communities across the Lake District National Park have had some feedback of that kind and some support of that kind. The other thing I was going to talk about a bit more was campaigns. There have been campaigns that the Friends have been very heavily involved in to do with water extraction. Is Miles on this Zoom? Right, I'm not going to talk about Birkett because the great local expert about Birkett is listening in, but I will say a little bit about it. There have been campaigns about the use of the lake, about better undergrounding of intrusive wires, and about raising planning concerns and landscape concerns about car parks. Sorry, Miles, I didn't mean to personalise this. Water extraction, there was a huge campaign in the 1960s, which, as I've mentioned, there are people listening to this Zoom who know much more about this than I do. But that was a very problematic and complex collection of locals and a number of key heavyweight campaigners, including Lord Birkett, opposing Manchester's attempt to take water out of Ullswater. And as part of that, the Friends were key players and indeed pushed very hard for this. There have been later controls, as some of you will know about Ullswater, but they have been much less than was originally feared, and the lake was significantly less damaged than was expected. There is far more about that already on the Friends website, I think, because Miles's talk is still there, so people who need to know should look at that. Using the lake for recreation is a huge issue and became a very big issue late in the 1960s and early in the 1970s. The Friends were one of the many organisations campaigning very much less speed on Ullswater. That meant at the time primarily water skiers. There were other big users, including the steamers, who were more controlled in terms of their decisions about speed. And this was a success. Agreed controls, though you might not know it if you looked at the lake now, were introduced and mostly adhered to. And they have been since. So the lake should, on a peaceful day, look like this. But however, and this is slightly unfair because you really can't quite see it, this is a picture from 2021 in the summer. We were on a sailing boat and there were water skiers quite often back on Ullswater going well above the agreed speed limit. Now, in a way, it's not their fault because there is nothing that says you've got to go slowly, but that will become probably another area where some kind of campaigning and reminding will be needed. And at the moment, there are certainly rangers who go and look at the water skiers. Not all water skiers perhaps take the rangers as seriously as they might. And it's a potential area of concern for Ullswater, for some of the sites of special scientific interest around Ullswater, and for other tourist attractions. Lots of people here will know that there are far more paddleboarders, canoers than there were. They're not always the right mix with water skiers. And there are really probably campaigns looming, and again, not just on this lake, but possibly on other parts of the Lake District about this. I'm sorry the water skier is rather difficult to see, but there is a little white fluff, which is the wave. And I was cross about that. I think it's also important that we talk a little bit or learn a little bit about the undergrounding work that the Friends have been heavily involved in this area. In in the 1940s, the Friends first worked to deliver more problems about wires coming across the area. This went on till the 1970s. The last villages and remote farms here were joined to the electricity network in the 1970s. And there were very significant campaigns to push wires underground, particularly working up towards Martindale, for reasons that those of you who know that road will understand, and towards Deepdale, which is the far end of Glenridding and Patterdale. There was a big argument where the electricity company said couldn't possibly underground because it was far too expensive. And of course, it is much more expensive, 4 or 5 times more expensive. There were very complex disagreements between those campaigning for undergrounding and those who quite reasonably wanted to have electricity. if you're in a remote place, had become quite an important issue. In some communities, the Friends worked by offering some money to help towards the costs. But the main thing was running campaigns. So in the end, and I'm sure most of you will realise this, most of the wires to most of the more remote areas have been undergrounded. And that's been a significant, in my view, benefit for many in this area, where quite beautiful parts do not have large poles and large wires. It'll come again because there will be issues about the mobile phone networks, about faster broadband. But at the moment, undergrounding has remained a really key part of some of the work that organisations like the Friends have done for some of the communities in the Ullswater area. I'm going to talk a bit about some current, possibly threats and challenges, and some that have been threats and challenges to this area for quite a long time. Each of us will have different views about what is good development and what is not such good development. And the basic position of the Friends of the Lake District has been landscape intrusion. Now, landscape intrusion to each of us is very different. I quite like pink sheep. Not everybody else does. Some people would say that was not appropriate. But equally, we all have to have a thought to what is too intrusive and at what point the balance changes so that people are aware the landscape has in some way been damaged. I'm not sure how many of you know that Ullswater is one of the areas that has the most campsites in the national park. Some of them are incredibly well landscaped and beautifully hidden and really carefully managed. And others are larger, more visible, say, from the lake or from the high fells. And as they increase, because of course more people want to come, which is perfectly reasonable, there is a landscaping issue that needs to be thought about. Campsites need roads to get around, that's more tarmac, that's a landscape issue quite often. So those debates will, I'm sure, continue for many. Again, something to think about. The Friends has, as I said, people who consider planning applications and put in, on the whole, not objections, but concerns, issues to raise, things to think about. And it is possible, as some of you will know who know the landscaped camping sites, that they are not better hidden, but better developed in a way that is less intrusive. That can be done. One of the other very contentious areas is lakeshore development. And some of the boathouses, some of you will know, have been extended in ways that are possibly not as good for the landscape, and some have become houses. That hasn't necessarily been a good thing. Some of them have been kept very much in their original form, and that's fine. And it's more about thinking, should this be more? Should, for instance, houses that are by the lake automatically get jetties? Most people who live by the lake are assuming that they will be able to have a boat, fair enough. But again, there's a landscape issue as well as a general intrusion into some of the sites of scientific interest and so on. Around Ullswater and around many of the other lakes, there have been significant numbers of examples where small dwellings are becoming much larger. People who buy houses, on the whole, are going to improve them, maybe do them up, maybe divide them so that more than one family can live there. That's all fine. It's just how much larger can an environment take, can the landscape take, and what kind of larger. The person chairing this meeting has got a very large solar panel, and I think that's fine if it's discreet. Some of them are very much more intrusive, and we all have to make up our minds which we think are a landscape damage issue. Each of us reaches our own conclusion, and I'm not really putting you on the spot, Tim. I'm just mentioning, because I think it's a really interesting example. We all want to do something about, many of us want to do something about energy. Some of the things you want to try and do can be more visually intrusive, noisier, whatever. And I think we all need to think about that at the moment. And the Friends again comment on some of those proposals, saying exactly what I've just outlined. One of the other threats and challenges, certainly in the last 2 years, have been a whole lot of issues about transport and how people come here. And around Ullswater, there have been a number of very successful extended parking schemes, and that has brought money to people who were otherwise losing money. That has to be, from the general community point of view, quite a positive thing. Some of the car parks proposed, either permanent or short-term, are intrusive into the landscape, and some have been turned down by the planning authority for that reason. Again, the Friends have argued for the landscape issues, but I'm really clear that it's not a transport authority, it's not a transport charity, so we need to think more broadly about transport, which is a general issue rather than a Friends issue, but having more carefully managed parking and possibly more carefully managed access into the high lakes like Ullswater is a significant issue. On land management, that's partly about things like the Dark Skies project. Some of you may know that parts of the Lake District National Park have started switching off at night, and some of that is happening through the Friends around here. There have been some very successful reductions in high-level lighting and in lighting through the night. The Friends Dark Skies officer has been working in this area. I'm not sure if anybody knows that and has noticed, but it's certainly visible in some parts of the particular area that we're in, and some parts of Ullswater are significantly darker than they were. Some are not. It's the long-term pressure. I suppose I've touched on the planning pressures around here, and I think it's quite difficult, isn't it, when developments are important. Housing is important, parking is important, road improvements might be important. Again, what's the best way forward from the point of view of the landscape is different for some people than the best way forward from the point of view of those who live or are visiting here. And the point about the Friends of the Lake District has been, what's a landscape impact and how can that be reduced if there is landscape impact, if there is change or an objection. And in some cases, as I'm highlighting on this particular slide, limiting development on the shore or on the fells can be an example where Friends of the Lake District does say no. However, sometimes it's about saying not quite like that, and that's a different planning argument. And sometimes those arguments do reflect, with the communities and the other individuals involved, a change which will happen. There have been some along here. There was a very, probably the most prominent recently, is the agreement to have the design of Fully Bridge, New Bridge, re-picked up and reworked, where a lot of work went in, led by the community very significantly, into getting the right kind, right is perhaps a bit of a judgmental word, the most attractive bridge built, and the one that would also serve the community successfully. And that's been, in my view, a big success. Others may think differently, but certainly it was supported by the Friends. I'm not going to talk much longer. I hope this gives you some outline of some of the things the Friends of the Lake District has done and will continue to do in this area. I'm happy to discuss all of them further. Very happy to continue if that's, sorry, I don't know what I do about the mic. Just fine, leave it, thank you. The technical advice has been I just leave this, so I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Tim to manage whatever comes next.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Judith. It's really excellent that we've had your talk today, because for me, as a long-time supporter of Friends of the Lake District, you've given a new sense of what it stands for historically and what it stands for today. And I think there are many synergies between the work that we in Friends of the Ullswater Way are doing and yourselves. Maybe we could actually work closer together, but I think there are so many areas of mutual interest that and particularly the fact that you've given a talk on Ullswater as a whole, which of course is our speciality, if you like. I think it's very exciting to see how we can build on your talk today. Can I open up a debate? I've got many questions myself, but I think I'll leave that for a moment until we've seen either from the Zoom audience or the audience here if there are questions that people would like to kick off with. Maybe I can start with the audience in the village hall. Does anyone wish to raise any questions? Cecilia, yes. Well,
Thank you. Just when you put transport concerns there and address something about the parking, but I wonder if there's anything the Friends of the Lake District can do about the excessive number of cars coming to the valley and parking in the wrong places. I mean, you're not the transport authority, but is there anything that the Friends can do?
So
can I just repeat the question?
Yeah,
or maybe
you repeat it,
so
Tim.
because that's a bit difficult for the acoustic. Cecilia raises a question about transport and what the Friends is doing or can do to address this issue, which is a burning issue for many of us in this valley. And you said in your talk we have 500,000 people who visit the valley every year. How do they get here? How do they leave? What do they leave as a trace?
Thank you, Cecilia, for raising such a non-contentious topic. I mean, I think the 500,000 is a pre-COVID estimate. So coming back to Cecilia's point about rising numbers, I think there probably are more, but I don't think anybody has quite estimated that. Transport, as I said, is not a Friends because it's a landscape issue, but parking, numbers pounding up some of the paths, these are all landscape issues, aren't they? And people blocking roads is both a landscape issue and a safety issue. So in a sense, there is a whole lot of involvement, isn't there, of a whole range of things. I think, so the Friends is part of the Lake District National Park Partnership, which is, I'm going to get the number wrong. Steve Radcliffe looking. 26, I think it's 26. Do you? Yes. May have gone up by one, that's my, I'm nervous. So there are 26 organisations working together. They, at the moment, have a transport subgroup, which includes the Friends of the Lake District, that is looking to do research both on the short-term pressures and on the medium-term possible solutions. I mean, people will know there are lots of possible solutions. You could ban visitors' cars. You could close some of the roads on high days and holidays. All these things are a possibility. Some of them have a really damaging impact on the communities. Farmers need to move stock around. Deliveries need to happen. And you can't say they can only happen before 5 in the morning or in the winter. But I think on that working group, there will be some thoughts and some research will go into how other parks. There are bits of Europe that have managed to control some of their access, very popular ski resorts that have joined up to control access, but they're funding subsidised buses for people. And I think that's a very interesting and probably a possible part of the solution. We could, and this is something I feel very strongly about, we could also join the bus service to the train service in a way that makes sense. The person who's asked this question for the benefit of other people is a very keen cyclist. So I think it's also worth saying that we could have more bike tracks and more bike routes that could bring people here. There are more electric bikes around slightly. Some of the roads are not safe for cyclists. So that's not a Friends issue, that's a safety issue, isn't it? Anyway, do you want to?
Okay, can I take another question from the hall and then we'll transfer to Zoom?
Just work on from your last point, is there any conflict within the Friends of the Lake District between encouraging cycling and damage to the landscape?
So the question relates to potential conflict between supporting or promoting cycling and potential damage to landscape.
Okay, so this is another keen cyclist. This is unfair. However, I mean, cycling doesn't need to damage the landscape unless there are some tracks on the high fells which are used by some groups of cyclists that are potentially damaging sometimes if there were too many cyclists. That's just a view. High Street can be quite problematic in that way because it needs restoring every so often. But I don't think cycling, should it be, it isn't a damage. It's a peace, on the whole, it's a peaceful, unless there are vast crowds, and positive way of moving around. And in most national parks, including parts of this one, it's a very successful way of moving around. And some of the most successful events in the Lake District, this is not a friend's point, are things like the Fred Whitton, which are hugely well established and hugely popular, both for taking part and for going to see. And I think that's really positive, and it, on the whole, isn't damaging. Issue is about large vehicles, large cars, lots of cyclists, lots of motorbikes, all trying to use the same quite narrow roads. That's a slightly different point. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Can I ask my colleagues if there are any questions on Zoom?
Not in the chat, but I would suggest that if people could ask, if you would like to ask a question, can you tell them?
Yeah.
Then they
If you, maybe for those on the Zoom, could you use the sort of traditional way of doing it to formulate a question in the chat and then
or just
wave.
or wave and someone will ask the
unmute
question.
yourself and tell us.
And what's it?
Unmute.
Unmute
yourself,
yourself, yeah.
please, and tell us.
Can I throw in a question whilst people are thinking about that? It was created in 1934.
Correct.
It was created because it wanted to conserve landscape as the primary driver
Yes.
of its
And the fear
origins.
was that the roads would be widened, more people would come, and this is very much where we are still, isn't it?
So my question, is there a debate within the Friends saying landscape is an issue, but many would argue it's not the primary issue, or at least it's not necessarily the top of the priorities. If you're looking at reports done by the Park Authority, there are many issues related to biodiversity loss, related to pollution, related to the threats to the farming community, changing lifestyles and so on. Do you think that landscape still is the top issue? And is there a debate within the FLD to look at the original aims of the organisation and see whether they're still fit for purpose?
So looking at the aims and purpose of the organisation and the objectives of the charity, that's something that's done on any charity, has to do that on a reasonably regular basis. In the Friends of the Lake District's particular purpose, every 3 years or so, the strategic direction, the objectives of the charity are looked at with great care. So in a way, that's a sort of formal thing. Equally, some of the things you mentioned are absolutely integral to the landscape. So the changes that hover over small farming communities, which is primarily what the uplands are, the question of how far different kinds of power should be available, which is the climate change issue. Those are all big parts of what the landscape may or may not develop in the next, I'm going to say for the sake of this conversation, 20 to 50 years. That's slightly odd, isn't it? But in those periods, there will be planning to develop possibly different kinds of power, more wind across the national park. Is that okay? It's a very windy place. That's perfectly legitimate, isn't it? There are planning issues about intrusion in the landscape, and those have to be balanced, I think, partly for the good of the communities that are resident, partly for those who are coming. I think it is all part of the quite big picture. There is also a slightly odd issue about being in a World Heritage Site for the Lake District National Park, this is, that was very much predicated on small farming communities, terrifically strong cultural background, the dry stone walls being celebrated. Some of those things appear at the moment to many bits of the farming communities and the land managing communities to be part of the many factors that you've just raised. I think this is a huge topic, isn't it? And how small charities, and it is quite a small charity, deal with this. is still slightly unclear what part they play in that debate. And I'll come back to the National Park Partnership, which will be obviously the key lead on this. There's obviously a bit of an issue in Cumbria at the moment that the reorganisation will hold up some of the debate on that. This is the reorganisation of local government I'm talking about. Doesn't quite cover the point, Tim, but it's sort of taking it forwards in a way that works both for this kind of charity and for the other organisations involved. Does that make any sense?
It's a question really for me. That's what you say. There's a strategic review every 3 years.
Approximately,
and the next
yes.
one is due
24. So quite soon. I mean, sorry, I'm not going to use COVID as an excuse, but all sorts of bits of work have been shifted, haven't they? So that's when it's due. And that should happen. I mean, I think it's good for organisations of all kinds to look at themselves every so often.
Can I go back to the Zoom? Anything? No, Zoom?
Yeah, no, fine. Don't worry.
Can I go back to the audience here? I've got plenty of other questions up my sleeve. If, no, any-
I was going to ask, is there a policy for or against wind turbines?
No, there
so,
isn't.
So Pat has asked the question about whether or not there's a policy linked to wind turbines. There's been an even debate today, a rich debate on energy and the possibility of having to look at onshore and offshore wind farms. So what is the view of FLD on this?
No, there isn't, because some wind farms are perfectly all right if they are in scale and in the right place. And the real example in the Ullswater area is, of course, there are 3 turbines beside the Kirkstone Inn.
Yeah.
And it depends on your view of what smallish turbines should be like. I think I would take the view that they are not an intrusion in the landscape, and they also had a very significant impact on the economy of running the Kirkstone Inn, because it was paying enormous, or was about to be charged enormous bills for the power it was then getting. Now, other wind turbines are much more intrusive in some areas.
Well, the only ones I know about, who I think are accepted, the ones on the way from Kendal to Sedgwick, which I think are fine. But I don't know what other people think.
So that's the point is being made that in the south of the lakes, the Latrig turbines are perfectly all right. And I think, again, I mean, if they're in the right place,
It's a planning issue, isn't it?
it is a planning issue, and some are much more intrusive than others in all sorts of areas. I don't think you could just say everything is not acceptable. And wind is obviously, for a whole lot of other reasons, a very important part of the energy mix of the future, isn't it? But that's not a friend's point, that's an energy point. I don't know, what do other people think about wind turbines in national parks? Do you have a sort of, should there be none? Should there be some? You know, I think it's all right sometimes in the right place. And when so the ones at the top of the Kirkstone are sort of sheltered, if that's the right word, by the fells behind. So they're not very big. And I think, you know, like solar panels in the right place, they can be fine. That's a planning issue and a discussion about intrusion in that area. Is that right?
Yeah.
Anything else from?
Say a bit louder, ask them a bit louder.
Does anyone on Zoom wish to raise a question?
Whilst they're doing that, Judith, the National Park has a plan to increase tree cover from 13% to 17%. Is that something the Friends are getting involved with?
Yes. So the Friends, as I mentioned at the beginning, do own some land and some properties. And at the moment, there is very active tree cover being taken forward on several of those properties. For example, it owns land down by the Rustland Woods, doesn't own land immediately near Ullswater. It owned land off the M6 in an area, it's High Borrowdale. I know everywhere's called Borrowdale, this is a different Borrowdale. But there's a lot of tree cover. I think the issue with trees is not just slapping in any old tree, that's the issue. It's about having the right ones for the area they're going into, and also, if possible, obviously local species. I mean, the big example of tree cover that hasn't been brilliant is, of course, some of the Forestry Commission work from the 60s and 70s, which was both not very good for the areas they were planted in and was not very attractive from the landscape point of view. And I think many of those are now being backpedaled on, if that's the right word. And I think those are an improvement. Thirlmere is probably the biggest example that I can immediately think of. And that was not great, was it? But some of the present ones are much more thought through. I think it hasn't been one where a planning application has mostly been needed. So it hasn't been something other than by example that the Friends have been involved.
That's a question for you. Do you consider tranquility an important aspect of landscape quality? This is from Juliet.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I think most people who come to national parks, including this national park, think that they will be coming somewhere where there are beautiful spaces and, on the whole, quieter spaces, not in the villages and not in some of the towns, as everybody will know. But I think tranquility is an essential part of being out in what's called the great outdoors. And I think most of the Friends planning schemes take tranquility into account. And some of the concerns, for instance, raised about transport, this is not a Friends point, about motorbike rallies and so on. That's an issue for a number of people in a big way. Others are less intrusive.
So Basak, one of the people on Zoom, would agree with you. He says, yes, I think noise is a very important part of the landscape. Noise damages wildlife. Light is the same. Dark skies is a very good campaign.
Oh, thank you.
And there's a question here or a comment. The small wind turbine development is okay. It's when they're large developments, it's not so good.
Yes, which is what we were talking about. Developments in the wrong place, often not desirable. Thank you, whoever said it.
Sorry, that was Yvette.
So,
Jane, please, yes.
The World Heritage Bid regarded the hefting of herdwicks, the commoning, the whole ancient system of farming as key to the World Heritage Bid. But the various directives that have come since are reducing the number of sheep to the extent that the farming is no longer viable and the hefting doesn't work. So what Friends of Lake District view of the way this is going?
I mean, some of this.
Do you want to repeat?
Sorry, do you want to? Yes.
So the question is about hefting and the importance of hefting of herdwick sheep in the bid for World Heritage status for the park. And the question raises doubts whether the recent policy initiatives are reducing the number of sheep and hence actually potentially damaging the hefting technique or management of sheep. She asked your view on this, on the FLD view.
I mean, the view about the World Heritage Bid does say exactly that, doesn't it? It's very clear that the cultural landscape of the Lake District is about small farms, certain breeds of sheep. It doesn't say much about numbers of sheep. It does say good use of the land. And on the whole, if there are larger numbers of sheep, in some ways, the land is less well used and is less viable for the future. That's a bit of a sweeping statement, but that's one of the concerns, isn't it? I think the bigger issue in relation to how can the land be kept healthy is about some of the threats that currently face agriculture and particularly smaller farms. And I think those are very big issues, way beyond the small landscape charity, but very significant for the farmers' organisations, the land organisations, of which the Friends is one, but it's not necessarily quite the area that we would prioritise campaigning on, because there are other much heavier hitters already doing that. Certainly very supportive in lots of ways, but not really taking that as the prime part of the work the Friends does. And I mean, if you step back, if the farming communities in all upland areas, all small farms, were much more threatened, a lot of people would feel that was a huge loss to all sorts of areas, not just around here, but all over the place. And huge parts of communities would be very damaged. And I think that's incredibly important for all sorts of other reasons, of which that's a part. Sorry, that's a bit of a waffly answer, but it just isn't exactly what a landscape charity is campaigning about, but it's part of the work. And looking forwards, it's certainly part of the work with other people to think about what should come next. It's a very, there's lots here that's unknown though. People still don't know what money they're going to get for farms. And that's very odd, I think, but that's not a Friends campaigning. That's a National Farmers Union. They're a much bigger hitter.
Any more questions on Zoom?
Comments?
Maybe I'll just ask one last question and then we can close. My question is about when you started the talk, you said that Ullswater itself was a very special place, and it was in the planning process, the decision to have a very deep consultation with the community was a critical thing for Ullswater. My question is, at the moment, there are very few organisations that, if you like, represent Ullswater. There's the Ullswater Association, which regularly meets amongst primarily entrepreneurial organisations, B&Bs and so on. I was wondering two things. One, do you think it's useful to go back to the original document and review whether the right questions are asked at the right time and where we got to in relation to Ullswater? Do you think it's a useful exercise for the community to be consulted again? And linked to that, one of our very significant members has suggested that even the Friends of the Ullswater Way should change itself to becoming the Friends of Ullswater, because actually we're taking on issues that go beyond just the conservation landscape and other issues linked to the way, but we also are interested in Ullswater as an entity. And even one of our previous speakers, Professor Louise Mansfield, suggested that there should be a special brand for Ullswater because of its beauty and so on. I just wonder whether you think it's appropriate for FLB to be engaged in that sort of review process.
Okay, that's about 6 questions.
No, the review.
I think it's if communities group together, and that's what the Ullswater Plan pilot, which other people than myself were involved in, if they group together, they have more strength. That's kind of quite basic, isn't it? So the grouping around Ullswater, which was primarily, as I said, led by the Friends, but very heavily supported by the National Trust, by the steamers, by the parishes, and by a number of other people from the farming community, and people who are just genuinely interested in the future and prosperity of Ullswater. That was very much supported at the time because of the World Heritage Bid. There were some funds available, even to rent halls and things like that. So that makes a difference, doesn't it, to bring people from a more spread out area into one place. And there was a fairly clear explanation that bringing people together would be part of what fed into the World Heritage Bid. So that was of value. I think there was also, I mean, if these things come at the right time, they can work well. There was a very helpful National Park Ranger. The businesses were interested in pulling this together, and it was a point at which there were some concerns about some of the things that were possibly going to happen in the area. So I think all that made a difference to that point. I think that those things are valuable and people ought to be able to be brought together in that way, but it doesn't always work. And I think some of the projects that came out of that, the Ullswater Way being the big one, have been very successful and very valuable to the communities around the lake. Some people, faced with events, would say something slightly different, actually, on the day of the event, but that's a different point, isn't it? I think it's added to the enjoyment of Ullswater for lots of people. And some of the other bits of work that then also followed on the quality of the water were also very helpful and positive. I think there are quite strong arguments for those joins to be rebuilt or rethought through. Whether they're at that level or a broader level, that's up to the communities involved, isn't it? And the players involved and the landowners involved, about how far they want to be part of that. And I think when they work well. I mean, coming back to the Friends, I couldn't possibly comment on what the Friends should do in terms of being, that's really for people who are here in the audience and listening on Zoom, because that's about what do you think would work for your area. And I think that's different in every area, nothing to do with Cumbria, every area. People have different ways. There was quite a lot of evidence, wasn't there, during COVID, that some streets came together in an extraordinary way. Some villages did, others didn't. Now, what triggers what? And I don't know the answer to that. If you do, perhaps you could let everyone.
Gordon, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, you were part of this.
Thanks to Judith.
Well, I'm out of frame, Tim, so I'll let you do
Yeah.
that.
I just wanted to introduce Gordon Radburn, who's taken over as the chair of Friends of the Ullswater Valley. Gordon is a massive supporter and the founder of the Friends of the Ullswater Valley, and we're very privileged and happy to him now taking the chair.
Yeah, where do you want to be?
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. It's a great honour actually for me to take the chairmanship, and there's my two duties this evening. The first one for Tim, who has done a fantastic job as chair these last 3 years in very, very difficult circumstances through COVID. It's very difficult to achieve all the things you want to achieve, and Tim's done a great job, particularly in regard to the talks that are very well supported. As many as 100 people and more have come in on the Zooms. It's been a great success, and it's been very educational and instructive for not just people in Ullswater, but also beyond. And we've had people as far away as Australia actually zooming in and joining in the talks and the discussions that we've had, which is just fantastic. And we certainly need to maintain that in terms of live audience and zooming as well. And also in terms of the quality of the speakers that Tim's managed to find, he seems to be very well connected. We've had some great speakers, incredible speakers. So thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much for the chairmanship that you've given the group these last 3 years. So I think that deserves a round of applause. And for tonight, I'd really like to thank Judith for coming and giving this talk. It's incredible to think that the Friends of the Lake District were actually predecessors to the national park, and it's fantastic to know that they've actually carried on in the vein. And I know, but on many occasions, they actually help keep the national park right, and that's a very, very important function, because as we've seen in this valley, that the national park doesn't always back the right decisions. And I won't say anything about zip wires, but I think you all know what I mean. And Judith is now chair. I know she's been long involved. She's been long involved with this parish and the national park as well. And I know Judith will do a very good job on keeping the national park right and on the right track. So thank you very much for tonight, Judith. And again, another round of applause. Thank you to everyone in the hall this evening, and thank you to you all joining us on Zoom, and we hope to see you next time.